But I wanted to, before we started, I wanted to invite you to stand up and change tables again. Part of it here is to get to know and get to meet other people. And may I suggest that if you're at the end of the room, you might hear better and see the body language of the folks at the panel better if you're up front. So maybe the front tables to fill those and leave the back tables a bit empty. So move toward the front. And if you're at a front table, move to a side table. Thank you. I'll tell Stephen he can come up.
Sure. Mark, why don't you take a seat? Nettie. Nettie, can you come and join us up here? Okay, folks, as we're gathering, Stephen, you may have noticed there's a lot of technical equipment and stuff up at the back. We're live streaming this meeting, and so Stephen, who's our live streamer, is going to explain a little bit about what's going to happen. And then we'll get the panel. Are you coming up here or no?
Well, friends, what a privilege to be with you tonight, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I do this kind of work for the United Church of Canada, where I mostly do webinars where every individual sits in front of their own computer. So this is a little unusual even for me, but I'm excited and delighted to be with you. You'll notice that we've got 3 cameras in the room. There's one over there and one beside me and one up there. And I control them all with a joystick over here where I'm sitting. So you may find that you're on camera. I hope that's okay. If there's somebody who really doesn't want to be on camera, maybe you could sit right over in that corner of the room. And I promise you, over by where the buffet table was. And I promise you I won't pick you up. But my hope is that if you're asking a question, that the people in Saskatchewan will be able to see your face and know that you're a real person. The reason that we're using microphones, though, is because the people in Saskatchewan can't hear you without it. You just can't yell loud enough to get there. So we have a couple of wireless mics, handheld mics, and we're just going to pass them around in the crowd. And if you have a question, put your hand up, and that's kind of like a talking stick. Please don't say anything unless you've got the talking stick in your hand. And that way we'll make sure that the folks who are watching by the live stream can also hear you. We're also inviting the people on the live stream to send us their questions if they have questions. So when we get into the Q&A time, I'm going to put my email up on the screen, my email address, and if they send me a question, I will wave my hand and ask permission to speak and read the question to you. Now, the live stream is about 45 seconds behind what's live here. So just to let you know, they may be asking a question that somebody else in the room has already asked. But that's just the nature of YouTube Live. So they are about 45 seconds behind us. Or if they sign on late, they can scroll back and start from the beginning. It records as we go. And the last thing to say, and this is mostly for the benefit of the people on YouTube, is that we are broadcasting on a very low resolution. But I'm also making a local recording that is a much higher quality. So we'll have a higher quality recording of it here. We just can't push it out onto the internet. So thanks very much, and sorry to take so much time. And Peter, back over to you.
Thanks. Peter's got another announcement.
Yeah, just one more thing along those lines. This is a new feature of these kind of gatherings. You'll see in your package the social media information sheet, which provides information about Facebook and Twitter and other social media connections, including the names of folks at Twitter or Facebook. So also to encourage people to connect by the live streaming and to see and participate If you're that kind of person, hopefully you'll find this social media information sheet handy and can use that. So I just wanted to point that out in your packet. Thank you.
Okay, we've called this panel a reflection panel. We've got Nemo Bassi, who isn't here yet. He's at the airport. He's coming from Nigeria, but he will be. We've got Nettie Webb, who's from Saskatchewan. Is it Webby? Webb. Weeb, I'm sorry. Nettie Weeb from Saskatchewan, farmer. And we've got Mark MacDonald, whom you've heard earlier. What's going to happen is they're going to speak for maybe 10 minutes each, and then there'll be a little discussion amongst the three of them if Nemo arrives, or the two of them if Nemo doesn't arrive. And then we'll open it up to comments or reflections from you. And the question that we've asked them to look at is, why is this important for faith communities? The whole issue of theology, technology, and ethics. Why is this important? Is it important for faith communities? And that's what our opening, panel is going to reflect on. So I'm going to ask Nettie to start this off, and maybe Nemo will arrive, and then we'll have Nemo, and then we'll have Mark. But if Nemo doesn't arrive, then we'll have Mark, and then we'll have Nemo. So let's start with Nettie. Nettie is a Canadian professor of philosophy from the University of Saskatchewan and has a PhD from the University of Calgary. She's a farm woman organizing person, a structural adjustment of Canadian agriculture, and she's a professor of church and society. So first of all, I think we'd like to hear a couple of comments from Nettie.
Would it be in position to ask you to stand when you speak?
No.
It will be easier to see you,
Okay.
both for the people in the room and also for the people
Sure.
in the room. Thank you very much.
We should have put on a lectern or something. There is one. Yeah, there is. Do you want a lectern?
Well,
You want the lectern up here?
I'm easy. However, do you need a lectern? I don't need one. No? All right. Well, let's just proceed. Good evening. Let me just do a small correction on the introduction, and that is that I retired from teaching a few years ago, and now am a full-time farmer, and importantly, a grandma, which is part of what occasioned the retirement. Because being a grandparent is, for me, a very important new role, a relatively new role, and one filled with a great deal of joy. And I don't want to say so much directly to the question of why it's important for faith communities, because it seems to me that it's not just faith communities, it's all of us who are engaged in these conversations, and our faith surely informs how we engage. So let me just put in front of you a few thoughts that I had about this topic of how we engage in the world around us and who we are in the world around us. This whole topic of synthetic biology and seeds and the ownership of seeds is very much a current topic. In fact, the FAO is right now, there's a gathering of the international plant treaties going on in these last days, where Via Campesina, the peasant organizations, are trying vigorously to defend small-scale farmer peasant rights to own seed, to use seed, to trade seed, and to push back on that huge and I think very dangerous trend of ownership and patents and life forms being owned by, manipulated, and completely controlled by fewer and fewer players. I don't want to talk about that. There are others in the room who have much better expertise than I on that. But just let me say that that seems to me a fundamental topic for all of us, because it is about life and about who we are. And I have three pieces I want to put in front of you, three sort of questions. The first emerges from how conscious I am myself as a farmer about the question of where we are. Who we are and where we are. And those are, of course, deep theological questions. Who we are in the world and what is the world around us. I farm in Saskatchewan, and I just commented when I landed here in Toronto how lovely the weather is here, because by us, it's staying below zero during the day these days, and we have a small layer of snow on the ground. And winter is upon us, or very close. It's breathing on us. So, and it's a cold breath. So I'm very, very aware of how the seasons and how the weather, where we live, is an important part of our daily lives. We've got our harvest in, thank goodness. It was a small harvest because we had a drought, a very serious drought in our area. But all of that is very much connected to where I live, which kind of a world I'm in. And it seems to me that, as Sally McFaig reminded us, it would make a huge difference in how we live if we understood better where we live. And that's more than just about information. It's about understanding deeply and clearly what is around us. We live in a very, very complex world. And usually when people say that, immediately it goes to technology, all these new technologies. And we will, of course, in these next few days discuss and probably be baffled by just how complex these new technologies are. Or at least some of us who don't have scientific backgrounds will be baffled, without a doubt. But it seems to me that it's kind of ironical that we know how complex, we respect how complex the technologies are, but we fail to understand, in fact, I think we're woefully oblivious to how complex natural systems are around us. Just how complex the microorganisms in a handful of soil is. How much is there, how much is living, how it's interactive, how it's interrelated. And I'm, of course, living out there on a farm. I continue to be amazed and astonished at what we don't know about where we live when it comes to the biological world. So I think it's an extremely important piece that we need to revisit, this question of where we live and who we are there. And for me, it always evokes, and I think this is, once you begin to contemplate how complex it evokes wonder and a great deal of humility. How complex this world is, and how wondrous it is. And also how interrelated it is, and that's part of the complexity, is that it's not easy to deconstruct. In fact, when we do deconstruct and extract elements out of it, and we'll hear more about this in these next days, we very often make unbelievably grave errors in what we didn't know about the interrelationship. I'm just, in the farming sector, for example, we have these wonderful technologies, seed treatment technologies, and then some years later it becomes clear that, but that actually is harming, those neonicotinoids are harming bee populations, and bee populations are actually essential to all kinds of living systems around us. And that interrelatedness, it seems to me, is part of what we often miss about where we live. Interrelatedness between the various communities, life communities around us, but also our place in it, how dependent we are on it, that we are not rulers. Despite our powerful technologies, we are not rulers, and this is part of our ongoing theological discussion around stewardship. I want to challenge that. I think we are not even stewards. That's not the right way. We're not managers or stewards. We must begin to think of ourselves more as neighbors in among other living communities, most of which are not human, but are communities and are interrelated and of which we are parts. In the Via Campesina, the international peasant and small-scale farmer movement of which the Farmers Union is a part, there are peoples who talk not only metaphorically, but quite literally about Mother Earth, who talk of kinship groups, not just among their human relatives, but kinship in other parts of living systems. And it seems to me that revisioning of who we are, not only where we are, but who we are among others, is a key part of understanding how we go forward. If we don't know who we are, we will travel, and I think maybe we are already guilty of this, we will travel into directions and cause harm that we haven't even begun to understand the implications of. So it seems to me once we know a little more about who we are and where we are, then attitudes of care and tenderness rather than management are evoked and are appropriate. Let me say one final thing about this as an opening, and that is that I think one of our tendencies, and this is very much the industrial mindset, has been to deconstruct, to disintegrate parts of knowledge, and I think what we will hear about synthetic biology is another powerful technology which deconstructs and then reconstructs, but deconstructs. And my own sense is that that misleads us on both of those first questions around who we are and where we are in a very fundamental way. Many of you are familiar with Thomas Berry, who calls himself not a theologian but a geologian, who wrote in one of his last pieces that he says, a rather autistic relationship with the rest of nature. We are as if we're somehow apart from it, and we don't really understand what we're a part of, what we're apart from. We're not understanding the context well enough to really be functional within the rest of nature. And it struck me when I read that in some ways that's part of how we understand. We deconstruct, we take into parts, and that's very much the industrial process, and then we understand pieces of it and manipulate them and reconstruct and make something that we think we'll find more useful. But think of how the language, a little bit about the language around it. When you say disintegrate fast enough, it's disintegration. Disintegration is destruction in English. The language is instructive here. Speed matters. We cannot adapt to new technologies, and our organisms cannot readapt to the new neighborhoods if the speed is so rapid that adaptation becomes impossible. Speed matters, the speed of how we speak of it and the speed of how we do it. I would recommend that we slow down, that we think about integration and integrity rather than disintegration leading to disintegration. Thank you.
Thank you, Nettie. Well, certainly something for us to try to slow down and think about integration and humility. I'm going to ask Mark now if he will give us his thoughts and his reflection.
Thank you very much. My small contribution to this discussion really comes out of what might seem like a contradiction, and that is that the indigenous people generally have a very optimistic and positive view of the development of human knowledge. You'll just have to take my word for that. That's been my experience overall. At the same time, indigenous people have been at the forefront of resisting the science-based commodification of life. And these two things I could, to some people, seem to be a contradiction. I would like to suggest that from an indigenous perspective, there are certain distortions to human knowledge that have been introduced in the Western discussion, which have created some danger to to creation and to all of us as humanity. And in responding to those distortions, those dangerous distortions, I'm going to talk about that from two different directions. There's a lot more that could be said, but in the time that we have, I would like to just mention two. In general, I would like to say, reworking Naomi Klein's recent book's title, she said her book title is No is Not Enough. I would like to say that regulation is not enough, that there has to be some contextual things in terms of the way that we deal with knowledge that are important to this discussion. As I said, indigenous philosophy, as I have encountered it and experienced it, is generally very, very positive about life, but is also aware of the way in which certain things can be distorted. And so indigenous people talk about four-directional thinking, the need to weave together spiritual, physical, emotional, and social aspects of knowledge. That there has to be this, if you look at something from only one direction, even though what you see may be accurate from that direction, your perception is distorted. So four-directional thinking says that we must look, truth is only discovered when we look at something from a minimum of four different directions. So, scientific knowledge needs to be woven back into the other types of knowledge, into spirituality, into psychology, into sociology. It needs to be seen for what it is, and that is an accurate description of one aspect or one direction of life, rather than a comprehensive view. The problem here is the comprehensive claims that science makes about the breadth and depth of its knowledge and authority. I think that it has to be placed more humbly in a relationship with other forms of knowledge. What we've seen in terms of science is that it gives, if you will, a distorted view of human life. Now, saying this to a group like this is a dangerous thing. I'm trying to preserve a positive understanding of human knowledge, including science, and perhaps especially science. But at the same time, I would want to argue that science has demonstrated its lack of comprehensiveness in the way in which, as science has expanded and grown, and the scientific knowledge has expanded and grown, at the same time, human culture and metropolitan societies have increased their distance in terms of their understanding of their relationship to the environment around them. In other words, science, Western science, has contributed to the objectification of knowledge in such a way that it has increased the alienation of humanity from the rest of creation. And so hopefully we can talk about that later. The second area where I would like to talk about, moving from four-directional thinking to a more contextualized understanding of how we are shaped as human beings. I think indigenous elders would argue that human beings are being shaped spiritually and formed spiritually more and more by the environment around it. And those factors, what's forming people's souls, are economic factors, the way in which commodification has infected human culture. This has shaped the soul of human beings in such a way that it has distorted the humanity's view of the world around it. And so, speaking here using Western terms, there is a blasphemous claim in the centrality of humanity to the rest of creation. There is a blasphemous claim to authority in relationship to the rest of humanity, to the rest of creation. And there is an infection from an idolatrous relationship to money, which has infected the way in which we perceive life and the way that we perceive each other, the way that we perceive creation. So these two distortions, what Christians have historically called blasphemy and idolatry, these two distortions mean that I think are at the heart of why indigenous people are afraid of the dangerous distortions that come from the commodification of life, and why, on the one hand, there's this positive understanding of science and human knowledge, this optimistic understanding of science and human knowledge, and at the same time, a deep, deep reservation about the way in which this science is proceeding relative to life. And this primarily is the commodification. I think for the churches and for religious groups, just saying regulation does not give a full picture of what it is that we are required to do and to be in relationship to our larger culture. I think that this whole issue calls into question some of the deep currents of our cultural life and the way in which those deep currents have shaped our minds, our imaginations, and our morals in such a way that we are putting life itself at peril, and certainly are stunting our capacity for the flourishing of creation and the flourishing of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Well, before we give you folks a chance, is there any comment, Nettie, you would like to make on Mark's comments, or Mark on Nettie, or anything you'd like to draw out from what was said, or questions you want to ask, or?
Well, I want to contemplate a little your first point around how knowledge is formed, and ask you whether, when you speak of that, you're speaking of a traditional indigenous perspective, or whether our contemporaries in the indigenous communities are also shaped, as you say in the last part of your remarks, by the current industrial capitalist systems that we're part of. Like, where are you locating that wisdom?
Well, I would locate that wisdom in the traditions of the elders, and but I would also say that there is a wisdom in the contemporary indigenous resistance to some of the larger trends of Western life, and the kind of opposition of indigenous people to some of the aspects of life. Now, so I would claim that contemporary indigenous knowledge is fighting the best it can against 500 years of colonial oppression, and that it's doing the best that it can to respond in a fulsome way to the crisis, the moral and spiritual crisis that's upon us because of the way in which humanity is headed relative to the rest of creation. So I think there's both wisdom in the past, in traditional knowledge, and I think there's also wisdom emerging in the way in which indigenous people live their lives today. Yeah. And by the way, I liked what you said. So.
Thank you. Well, now it's your turn. If you have questions or comments, and as Stephen has said earlier, you have to have this, because that's the only way the people in Saskatchewan will be able to hear you. So is there anybody, conversation, anybody got questions or anything they want to add to what they've heard so far? Lucy?
Thank you. Bishop MacDonald, you said regulation is not enough. It doesn't give us a full picture of what we are required to do or be. And tomorrow night I'm speaking as well on this issue of what to do about new technologies. And I was going to speak about regulation, but acknowledging its limitation, that we order ourselves at the moment in relation to new technologies through the state and through regulation. And looking at regulation of genetic engineering thus far, we can really see those limitations. And I'm wondering if you have something to say about what it looks like if we are to actually, in community, do something other than depend on this regulation as the way it's constructed now, and what might that look like? Or, you know, is that something that faith-based communities already do? If new technologies are reordering our world, or have the potential to reorder the world around us, but also, as you say, impact our imagination in the way that they might be put out in the world, how then do we are agents in the reordering instead of just allowing this reordering to happen?
Thank you very much for that question. I think that we, as faith-based organizations, can look to Indigenous peoples' attempt to shape and form souls and minds and hearts and bodies somewhat in opposition to the values and to the values and the morals and shape of modern society. I think that the religious institutions, the spiritual institutions, for the most part, have accepted the fact that most of the spiritual formation of people within them happens outside of the church. I think that's a painful thing to acknowledge, but I think that for the most part it is true. It seems to me that what faith-based communities are called to do is called to, in addition to working for regulation. I'm not speaking against regulation in any way, shape, or form. But in addition to that, we need to take seriously our task to shape each other's souls and imaginations and our life in community, so that it becomes absolutely essential that we get into the business of shaping people's minds, imaginations, and souls in relationship to creation, in relationship to the rest of humanity. So for me, what that looks like is a rediscovery of who we are and what we are to be relative to the rest of creation. And I think that that means taking very seriously our task to form souls in opposition to the way in which souls are being formed, in opposition to that, and to realize how deeply our institutions have been infected by those values, by those ideals, and by our capitulation to the spiritual formation that we've received from this culture of money. This culture of money.
Well, as someone who has been very active in policy debates and advocacy for certain kinds of policies, particularly in farm politics, I'm loath to in any way say that we could do without regulations. That seems to me absolutely and absolutely necessary, and maybe more so because the technologies, as they become more powerful, have huger impacts on with bigger scope and bigger possibility for great harm. So hemming that in with conscientious regulatory structures seems to me absolutely necessary. But I just want to nod my head to something you've said around formation of thinking around it. And that is that regulations, we can't defend regulations or institute new regulations unless there's a social momentum to demand that those be in place. And that's where this rethinking, this reshaping our societies and revisiting the values on which they're based is absolutely key. The regulatory framework can't be constructed without the pillars of social movement and faith-based movement.
Thank you. We've got 2 mics now, so there's a question up at the back there.
My name is Raja, and Ann Mitchell and I, almost 8 years ago, published a pamphlet on GMOs, and it was published by the Quaker Institute for the Future, and it had a subtitle, The Need for Public Policy. 8 years later, we are much farther from meeting that need than it was when we wrote it. I have 2 questions. The reference to conscientious regulatory structure and social momentum should demand it. I think I very much like that. We need a regulatory structure. And if I pick it up with a topic mentioned at the beginning, intellectual property, what I find difficult, I hope panelists and anybody else can get to this. We are living in a world in which our government, all right, I'll speak about Canada, you can speak about your respective governments, has conceded, ceded, surrendered many things related to intellectual property and things in trade agreements. It's in NAFTA, it's in the agreement with the EU. I believe it is in TPP, that's the one I read more recently. It's going to be in the one between Canada and UK after UK exits from EU. So my question is, how do we put any pressure on our governments to do anything when they have already given up the authority to do any regulation, any control of intellectual property, and anything along those lines?
I feel a wave of sort of political fervor overtaking me, but I'm not. Let me just say that I think you're right. Governments have been in collusion with the industry around these intellectual property rights. Because when all else in these trade agreements was being negotiated on the grounds that we wanted to erase barriers to trade, we wanted to unravel the regulatory framework. As a matter of fact, on that file, the opposite happened. And ironically, on that file, there's more draconian legislation and defense of those particular property rights. So yeah, I think that's without a doubt, that's how the trade agreements have read, and that's what we see happening. It seems to me that we need to just reframe our thinking around intellectual property rights from the ground up, actually from beneath the ground, from the seed in the ground up. Because that whole construct, that whole way of seeing ownership of life forms is in some ways so fundamentally flawed. If you think that even in agriculture, for example, I mean, I farm, that our varieties, our seed varieties, and the traits and the development of those seeds come out of hundreds, in some cases, thousands of years of knowledge gathering, seed gathering, experimentation, saving of seeds from indigenous peoples, many women whose knowledge it is. And the idea that at this late moment you superimpose an ownership on that knowledge is already bogus. So I think we need to challenge that whole idea. I mean, of course, the regulations have to be challenged, but we need to challenge the fundamental idea of ownership of life forms. I said earlier that we are one kind of living community in a myriad of living communities of all kinds, hugely diverse, wondrous, just an amazing interrelatedness. And the idea that we have somehow usurped ownership of that is preposterous.
Let's have one other. Okay, there's a question. And then Nemo has arrived. So after we've had this question and a little comments, then we'll have Nemo as our third reflective person and see if he can just figure out what these other two guys have been saying, and we'll take it from there. But let's have Jim.
Hello, so my name is Jim Thomas. I work on these issues around synthetic biology. I know Nettie. Thank you very much. I really appreciated your remarks. I think I have a question about myths and stories, and just would appreciate your reflection. So in the area of synthetic biology, we have a movement emerging, which is, or a set of proposals that are around using synthetic biology to preserve nature, releasing gene drives, for example, to get rid of invasive species, or developing crops that will survive climate change and so forth. And this is cast very much in terms of stewardship. So I was very interested in your comment, Nettie, that we should forget stewardship and think about neighborliness. I like that, actually. But we do have these stories, like I think about the story of Noah's Ark, where in times of crisis, humanity, in the Noah and his wife and his children, have gathered in, have engineered something in order to protect their neighbors and take them through the crisis. And that kind of a story is what we're hearing about synthetic biology, that in these times of crisis, whether it's climate change or the sixth great extinction and so forth, it's a time for engineers to build something and sail through the storm with our neighbors. I'm curious what you think of those sort of myths.
They're putting you on the spot, eh?
All right, the Noah story. The boat wasn't nearly big enough. He didn't see nearly everything that was around him. I mean, it might be interpreted to say exactly that, and then human beings on the side of God saved the world. But that's really not the story of the human beings. It's very clear that we're probably causing the flood rather than building the arks. So I don't know how, and there's a lot to be said around this whole view of ourselves as saviors of species and saviors in various ways, but the literature doesn't support that anywhere, and nor does the scientific evidence support that we're actually enhancing biodiversity, that we're improving the climate, that we're dampening down the storms, that we're holding off the floods. In fact, every newscast you hear, at least once a week, you hear of some major disaster, many of them in one way or another engineered by the human community. So, I mean, I think we should take that story and, keep singing those delightful songs about 2 by 2 and so on and so forth onto the ark. But other than that, we shouldn't imagine that we're in that place and we are that Noah family. We're not.
Thank you.
I began earlier tonight by giving a very what I think is a very positive story about human knowledge and hope in the midst of things. So again, I wouldn't want to lose that. But an essential part of that is having the spiritual capacity as well as the intellectual capacity, the moral capacity as well as the intellectual capacity, to know where the road leads, where we're being led in a good way. So again, what I was trying to say had to do with the both the personal way that we receive knowledge and process it, but also the communal way that we receive knowledge and process it. It seems to me that it has to be more fulsome in terms of representing the breadth and depth of human knowledge and human endeavor. So by all means, stories are good. They have to be interpreted, I think, with care.
Nemo, would you like to come up and sit up here? Why we're doing this with the mic is because it's all been live streamed. So you have to have the mic in front of your face before people can hear you. Fred, I know you wanted to ask a question. Can we have Nemo, and then we can pick up the conversation afterwards. Thank you very much. So I got to get my notes for you. Nemo has just arrived from Nigeria. Did you arrive from Nigeria half an hour ago? Okay, well, I'm sure you must be tired. And we haven't even offered him any supper. Nemo is an architect from Nigeria. He's an environmental activist, he's an author, and he's a poet. He's chaired Friends of the Earth International between 2008 and 2012. He's the executive director of the Environmental Rights Action for 2 decades, and the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, which is an ecological think tank and advocacy organization. Nemo was listed as one of Time Magazine's Heroes of the Environment in 2010 and won the Right Livelihood Award, known as the Alternate Nobel Prize. So, Nemo, we are wanting some some reflections, ethical, theological reflections on technologies and why faith communities should be concerned or show any interest. Stephen, who's doing the live streaming, would like you to stand up, although you're tall, so maybe you can be... It would still help. It would still help, so that you can be seen.
Well, good evening. Let me apologize for coming in late. It wasn't totally my fault. I couldn't take over the aircraft. But it's really this is a very important conversation concerning where mankind has gone to. But we believe that we can fix everything, that we can do whatever we want to do through technology. Just looking at the diversity that the world has had to enjoy over the centuries. There were thousands of varieties of crops and animals that human beings depended on. And now we just have a few of these varieties because of industrial production systems. And even the few we have is being eroded further, with just a few corporations taking controlling the seeds and having patent on life and all kinds of incredible things all coming together basically because over the years, humans have gone to believe, generally, broadly speaking, that we cannot do things together except we operate as corporations. That only corporations can do things efficiently, effectively. And so we've privatized everything, probably including government. So government is no longer, democracy is no longer government of the people, by the people for the people. It's now government of the corporations, by the corporation for the corporations. And so we are losing out in many ways. I would like to be very optimistic. I took that from your statement about being hopeful, because if we lose hope, then we lose everything. Now, just looking at we look at the redesigning tree of life. Right from when I heard about this topic, I got extremely excited, because I thought we have not been reflecting sufficiently on the tree of life. And I think about the tree of life, the river of life, the book of life, and all this come together so beautifully. The tree of life started from the Garden of Eden. It's such an enigma. But it's so central also because it was at the center of the garden. So positionally, geographically, it's something very central. Then I look at the book of Ezekiel, I see that there were trees, not just one, of life. And there was a huge diversity. And this is what really sustains life, diversity. And then in the book of Revelations, we're having these trees bringing forth fruits continuously for food, for healing. This is the way life is, that what we eat should feed us and not eat us. Nowadays, we are not sure what we're eating, no matter how much labels you read on the products, because there's such a huge distance between producers and consumers. And producers are going to bed hungry every day. Most of the hungry people in the world today are small-scale food producers. And why do they go hungry? Because of lack of support, because of lack of social safety nets, because of the way things are being run and they're just being ignored. Now, if you permit me for a moment, let me go back to where I'm coming from. I just came up from Nigeria, but right now we have biosafety regulators appointed into office a year ago who believe that everything engineered is okay. And these are the regulators. So when you have regulators who do not question science, who don't question the product of technology, then that's a problem. As I was coming on the road, I saw a sign at a bus station saying, it says, "We believe in rules." So the first lesson we teach our students is to question all the rules. And I thought maybe something like that. But I thought that was very instructive. Because if regulators don't reflect on what they are regulating, and they just take in line hook and sinker, whatever industry tells, whatever Monsanto tells them, Bayer or Syngenta or whoever tells them, then that is really dangerous. Would you believe that shortly after a genetically modified cotton variety failed in Burkina Faso, which is to the northwest of Nigeria, Nigeria approved the same variety for commercial placement in the market without any kind of testing whatsoever. And now, when Nigeria approves a thing, it makes other neighboring countries think that something good is in it. Because everybody's trying to catch up with an old technology. It's like catch up with a typewriter. I mean, this just doesn't make sense. And now the same variety is being pushed in Swaziland. And recently, the legislature in Uganda was more or less, I would say, forced in quotes to endorse a biosafety law, which is a way of saying, okay, open the doors for anything to come in. Those laws are not meant to regulate. They are there to permit. So they are permitting laws that we have in many of our countries in Africa. And it is extremely unfortunate. And so, you know, Africa is a very interesting continent. And the story, what you see in the media, what you read about, you hear about over the years, well, Africa is a hungry continent. And so the only way to feed Africa is through genetically engineered crops. Now, that argument did not work so effectively. So it's been modified to say Africans are malnourished, that the children are stunted and are going blind, and what Africa needs is vitamin A. So you have to now fortify key staple crops with vitamin A so as to get the children to grow and to see and all those things. But you see, the whole argument, the whole thing falls on its own face because life is best supported by biodiversity. And biodiversity is not just in the crops that we see, it's also in the soil. If the soil is poisoned by agrotoxics, you're not going to have the biodiversity you ought to have in the soil. You're not going to have the biodiversity you're going to have in the water. The man that drove me up here this evening, we have a lot of conversations. One of the things he said, which I thought was very important, was it takes hundreds of years for coral reefs to be built, to grow, to get to where they are, to be as diverse as they are to support life. But it takes just a few years to destroy them. It could take a month to destroy. There was a coral reef around Kribi in Cameroon, which was destroyed by the Chad-Cameroon oil pipeline, where it enters the sea. And so Exxon thought that the best way to replace it was to use old tires, car tires, to construct a coral reef. How smart, how quick can you just fix, destroy, then fix? This is the thinking that is crazy. But the coral reef, the tire, the plastic, the rubber coral reef did not work because the fish just moved away. Everything just moved away from it because it's toxic. I think other life forms perhaps are more intelligent than human beings. And this is difficult for us to understand because we tend to think that we are at the apex. I mean, it's theologically, yes, in terms of created beings, but there are so many other beings, and we've lost a sense of community, which I think is what I heard when I came in, this sense of community. And we are not the only beings on earth. There are beings visible, invisible. There are beings in the ground. There are beings in the air. There are beings everywhere. And collectively, we're all children of the earth. And so whatever we engineer for profit or for corporate interest affects everything else. And we can't really predict how everything else will respond, which is the threat that we're facing. And if you permit me, I'm just going from the aircraft, and a lot of things are going through my head. And so I'll just hang it there for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nima. Would either of you like to add, respond, or we'll go to questions? Go to questions. Fred, do you want to? Okay.
My name is Fred Bass. I am a Quaker from Vancouver. I have just a comment for both of you. Reverend McDonald, I think it's wrong to attribute a lot of what is called science now to science. It's actually bad science. It's biased science, often funded with economic interests, even through universities. But more important, it's only partial science, because if you don't look at the higher levels of functioning, particularly the ecological levels, you have no business fooling around with life. And synthetic biology leaves out the ecological interactions of what it's producing. Nettie, the thing I wanted to say that you said, for me it was echoing something that I read in a very interesting book called Einstein's God. And Einstein had great reverence for what he didn't know in the universe. It thrilled him to be connected to what he didn't know in the universe. And I think that much of spirituality and religion is along that same line. And I think the more commercial aspects of science focus on, with regret, on what they don't know that's going on around them. So I think it's very important for us to own viscerally what's out there that we don't know. So thank you for that remark.
I would just say quickly that I agree with what you said, and I think it's a good addition to what I said. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take Richard, and then Nete and Nemo are going to be here tomorrow. Unfortunately, Bishop Mark won't, but we can continue on these conversations tomorrow. So, Richard, you've got the last question.
Oh dear. My name is Richard Schneider, and I'm currently teaching a course on Orthodox Christianity and ethics. And the experience of teaching the course makes me want to point very deep to a fundamental problem that hasn't been talked about yet. And I think it's a problem which creates a near insuperable problem at the moment for what these wonderful things that you have offered. I'll do it by starting with Bishop Mark's idea of knowledge as a broad, unified whole, the fourfold way, or however many ways, but fourfold is good. And the difficulty is that we're talking about two absolutely incommensurable languages of knowledge. Science has its own rules of logic, its own axioms, its own language, its own sense of causation, and so on. The other three of your elements are essentially ethical. And ethics tends to care about those things. It cares about spirituality. It cares about values. It cares about feelings. And all of these things are inimical to science. They're ruled out by scientific language. And I think this has caused an awful lot of the difficulty. The commercialization factor is, of course, huge, but it's secondary. And primary is the fact that we simply have not learned to talk to each other. I can tell you certainly in the case of Orthodox theologians, when they try to do ethics and talk about science, all they do is use the language of Orthodox theology and just impose it willy-nilly on science as a value-laden language. So if we're going to have an impact, a moral impact on what science is doing to us, right, and have people listen, I think we're going to have people who are willing to work on this problem of making these languages commensurable, or we're simply not going to get anywhere. The example of nature as much more holistic and complex than we think it is, I know lots of scientists who would agree with that, who would say, yes, this is wonderful, but their whole complexity would be entirely within a natural history, ecological perspective. It wouldn't be a moral perspective. It would not be an ethical wholeness, but simply the fact that nature is very complicated. So I guess what I'm saying is that we have a very deep-rooted hermeneutic problem that nobody's facing up to.
Does anybody want a last word on that?
Well, I'm not so pessimistic about how deeply rooted that language problem is. I think there are lots of tenets of understanding. Just on a lighter note, I wear a t-shirt in my garden sometimes that says, scientists should always state the opinions on which their facts are based. And I think that in some ways is the reality of it. The scientific knowledge and the way in which technologies are justified are often actually, if you delve into it, quite value-laden. I mean, so it's a question of teasing out and articulating the values, the opinions on which the facts are based, and then we're in a real conversation. And I think that's our conversation to have.
Well, I think that's been a great start for our 2.5 days together. And I would like to thank Nettie and Mark and Nemo. I'm glad you made it, and I'm glad you're here for setting the way forward. We just have a couple of things now to do before the end of the evening. One is you can stay there or go back or whatever, stay there. It's only going to be a few minutes. The first thing is to just give you a little bit of a review of the program tomorrow. We start at 9 o'clock here. And the first panel, or it's the first speakers, it's on synthetic biology and overview. And that will be Jim Thomas and Craig Holdridge. So I think that will be fascinating. That will be giving us the information that we say, the background that we don't have. So we'll all be getting that in the morning. Then we have a break. Then we have a dialogue cafe where we are moving into self-selected groups. And that's going to be introduced by Peter, and he's going to say a few things about that tonight before we go home. Then at noon, we have a public policy perspective, and we have two speakers, Deborah Scott, whom we've met from the University of Edinburgh. I think you've met. She's here. There she is. And then Manola Pessoa de Miranda, who's from the Convention on Biodiversity Office in Montreal. And there are other people in this room who will be speaking and asking questions about public policy. We've already had Lucy, so she'll be there tomorrow as well. And this will be another fruitful discussions on background information about what is actually happening or not happening. And then in the afternoon, then there's lunch, which will be here. Then there's the promises of synthetic biology with Drew Endy, who hasn't arrived yet. He's arriving late tonight, and he'll just give a talk on the promises of synthetic biology. And then at 3 o'clock, we move into a large group dialogue where Peter will facilitate it, and we're going to hear stories as best we can from the people in the room. We all have stories, but we know for sure that Nemo will have stories, and Nettie will have stories, and Algerando from Mexico at the back up here will have stories. He is a vanilla farmer in Mexico, outside of Mexico City. And there will be somebody here to translate for us tomorrow. And then there'll be other people who've got stories of what's going on in the field. And then we close at 4:30-ish. And you're on your own till you come to the public meeting at 7. And we'll get more details about those on the public meeting as we're closing up tomorrow afternoon. So that's the plan for tomorrow. So get a good night's sleep and be here at 9. And before we go, Peter's got a couple of things to say. And then we're going to have a closing reflection. Moira's going to give us a closing prayer reflection.
Great, so it's the end of the evening, so I'll do this briefly, but I don't want to lose the moment. Tomorrow morning, for that dialogue cafe, we want 3 or 4 or 5 powerful, meaningful, relevant questions to explore and unpack together. So my question for you now is, what are the powerful, meaningful, relevant questions on your mind right now? Take a moment and jot them down. What are the powerful, meaningful, relevant questions on your mind right now that we need to work on these couple of days? take a minute or two of silence to jot down the ones that are just front of mind, and I'll capture a few of them, and we'll return to this again tomorrow morning. So just a minute or two of silence. Can you bring the microphone around? Where's the other one? Oh, yes, there we go. Okay, so let's just hear a few. I see most of the pens back up from the paper. Call them out. Andrew, Rebecca's got the microphone.
And so, what would it take for each of us personally to decolonize and decommodify our own thinking?
You start with the easy one. Please go ahead next. Bring it to the next person there, Rebecca.
J.D. Hansen. My question is, we have a history of having tried to eliminate or through the so-called science of eugenics, control Native peoples and African peoples. Now, as some people say, we should genetically engineer humans to eliminate diseases. They are choosing to lift up some diseases of Africans, for example, sickle cell, but not even having on the committees Africans or persons with those diseases. So how do we include in our concern about the genetic engineering of nature, the genetic engineering of humans?
Thank you, J.D. Stephen?
Is the only solution at hand a complete prohibition on synthetic biology, or are there possibilities that under certain conditions it might serve the common good?
Any others? Yes, please, Christine.
Picking up on what Nemo was saying about the power of imagery and what others were saying about the power of myth and stories. And then others were talking about the inability to really engage in meaningful dialogue because we're talking out of different frames of reference, using language differently. My question would be, what is the language in the form of myths and stories that can speak to and transform human spirits and souls?
Thank you, Christine. Let's hear one more, and then we'll end the night. Richard, or, well, two more yet. Richard and, was it Vince? Is that right? Did I catch your name right? Is it Vince? So Richard first
I
and
can
Raja.
speak without speaking.
Go ahead. Here, go ahead.
Since there's been a kind of agreement tonight that complex holistic thinking is going to be our salvation, that if we can just convert to that, I'd like to know how to change that from being a general principle to being a real guide to how to make ethical decisions.
Go ahead, Raja.
If we can genetically engineer and modify mosquitoes away and thereby save up to 750,000 to 1 million deaths every year, would we approve of that?
Okay, I suppose we're just getting started, and that was just the intent, to prime the pump. Also for tomorrow morning, we'll return to this after the first session tomorrow morning. So, Anne, I'm ready to pass it back to you and to Moira.
Moira's going to close with a reflection and prayer, and then it's a thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we could just take a minute to put ourselves at the disposal of God, our Creator. And my reflection and prayer, they're really woven together as I listen to our speakers. So there are many phrases that begin with help. May we learn to share our land in peace as we increase our knowledge, as we move towards sustainable farming and food for all. Give grace to all our churches, all our denominations, all of our societies, as we move forward in learning about synthetic biology and how it affects us in our societies. As Nellie said, this is about life and who we are in the world, and Bishop Mark repeated that. Help us to see this world we live in with clearer eyes. Help us to explore and wonder at this amazing biological world we live in. Help us to see the interrelatedness of everything in our systems, including our neighbors. Help us to slow down and to think about what we are going to do to become ever more integrated and less disintegrated. Help us to look at science too in a more integrated way with other forms of knowledge, spiritual, moral, social, and cultural. Help us to recognize the distortions to our souls caused by commodification, objectification, materialism, and so on, which affect all of our relationships and our relationships with the earth. We have much to learn about all these matters from our indigenous neighbors. Mostly help us to have hope through our trust in you, God, our Creator. And in a more practical way, help us to be aware of the need for small-scale producers simply to be able to sustain themselves. Help us to renew our sense of commitment and to realize what it really means for all of us to be children of the earth. And lead us safely home, literally and spiritually, and bless us in your creation as we leave this house of friends. Amen.